Hello everyone, my name is Kiran Raikar. The world is watching The Hague. NATO's 2025 summit could reshape global security, from Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific. But is the alliance still united, or is it starting to break from within? Between June 24th and 26th, leaders from all 32 NATO countries will meet in The Hague. It seems like just another summit, but in truth, it's a critical moment. Russia's war in Ukraine still rages. China is more assertive, and tensions within NATO are growing louder. So why The Hague? It's not random. The Hague is known as the city of peace and justice, home to the International Court of Justice and other key institutions. Let's discuss the key issues that can be discussed in the NATO Summit 2025 in The Hague, Netherlands. So, what's on the table in The Hague? First, NATO plans to raise defense targets from 2% to a combined 5% of GDP, 3.5% for military, 1.5% for infrastructure. Second, leaders will push for a major upgrade in capabilities, from AI and drones to missile defenses. Third, it's a turning point for Ukraine policy, as NATO reassesses long-term engagement. Fourth, NATO expands its horizon toward the Indo-Pacific and China, raising the question, can the alliance go global without losing focus? And fifth, with Mark Rutte now at the helm, NATO must prove unity at a moment of US political change. Why does France criticizes NATO policy? Let's discuss. Why does France criticizes NATO policy? France criticizes NATO policy for strategic, political, and sovereignty-related reasons. Too much US control. France feels NATO follows America too closely and wants Europe to have its own voice. Europe should not rely too heavily on the US for defense and foreign policy. President Emmanuel Macron. In 2019, he famously said NATO was experiencing brain death because Europe lacked control over its own security. France believes Europe should build independent defense capabilities and not always follow Washington's lead. Overdependence on US leadership. France is wary that NATO is becoming too US-centric, especially with Washington setting the agenda on Russia, China, and global military interventions. Macron wants Europe to have its own diplomatic voice, particularly in conflicts like Ukraine or the Middle East. NATO expansion risks escalation. France has cautioned against the rapid expansion of NATO, like Sweden and Finland joining, warning it may escalate tensions with Russia. Unfair burden. France criticizes pressure to spend more on defense just to meet US-led NATO goals. Different priorities. France wants NATO to focus more on terrorism, Africa, and diplomacy, not just Russia or China. But one issue dominates the NATO agenda, and it's been burning for over 2 years now: Ukraine. The war rages on. NATO has stood behind Kiev with weapons, training, and financial aid. But behind closed doors, there's division. Some allies want to go faster, others are hitting the brakes. Ukraine is NATO's top challenge. The alliance has supported Ukraine with weapons, training, and aid. But disagreements remain. The US and UK want faster action. Germany and Hungary are more hesitant. At this summit, NATO must decide, will it stay a supportive partner or offer Ukraine a clear path to membership? But Ukraine isn't the only challenge. Inside the alliance, the cracks are growing. While NATO appears united on the surface, there's a silent debate simmering underneath about money, power, and independence. Internally, NATO is under stress. Macron is calling for a more independent Europe. Turkey keeps balancing between NATO and Russia. And while the US spends more than 3% of its GDP on defense, most European countries fall short of NATO's 2% target. Washington wants more burden sharing, but Europe is asking, should we follow or lead? Let's see the defense spending in NATO 2024 overview. As per the official NATO report published in June 2024, defense expenditure across member countries remains highly uneven. Let's take a look at this chart from the report. Graph 4, defense expenditure as a share of GDP %. The NATO guideline urges all allies to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. However, As the graph shows, only 18 out of 31 NATO countries are projected to meet or exceed the 2% guideline in 2024. Poland leads with the highest defense expenditure at 4.12% of GDP, followed by the US, 3.43%, and Greece, 3.08%. Major European powers like Germany, 2.1%, France, 2.02%, and the UK, 2.25%, meet the threshold. Countries like Spain, 1.28%, Luxembourg, 1.29%, and Belgium, 1.29%, fall below the mark. This imbalance continues to fuel debates on fair burden sharing within NATO, with the United States consistently calling on European allies to contribute more. Sweden formally became NATO's 32nd member on March 7, 2024, when it deposited its instrument of accession and had its flag raised at NATO headquarters. Finland joined earlier, officially becoming the 31st member on April 4, 2023, marked by a ceremony in Brussels as its flag joined the NATO ranks. NATO is getting close to Russia border by adding Finland and Sweden. NATO is no longer just a Euro-Atlantic club. It's expanding both in membership and mission. Sweden and Finland joined NATO, extending the alliance's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometers. That's a seismic shift in Northern Europe's security map, and a clear message to Moscow. Russia immediately denounced Finland and Sweden's NATO entry as a dangerous, historic mistake, and warned it would take military countermeasures. President Putin stressed that while there are no territorial disputes, the deployment of NATO troops or infrastructure in their territories would compel a mirror response. The Kremlin vowed to strengthen its northwestern flank, deploying forces, nuclear-capable systems, and gray zone tools to counter NATO's expanding border. But the story doesn't end there. NATO is now turning its attention eastward, toward the Indo-Pacific. Why? Because China is rising fast. Beijing has strongly criticized NATO's eastward movement into the Asia-Pacific, accusing the alliance of a Cold War mindset and vowing a firm response from cyber warfare to military drills with Russia in the Pacific. China is asserting itself globally, and NATO is taking notice. So with new members, global ambitions, and rising tensions, where does all this leave NATO? This summit isn't just another diplomatic photo op, it's a crossroads moment, not only for NATO, but for the future of global security. With the US elections ahead and tensions rising across Europe and Asia, what's decided in The Hague may echo for decades, but this summit isn't just being watched by NATO members. Across the global south, in capitals like New Delhi, Brasilia, and Pretoria, leaders are watching what NATO does next. Because while they're not inside the alliance, the ripple effects of every decision are impossible to ignore. Even though India isn't in NATO, New Delhi is watching carefully. But India made it clear it values strategic autonomy, not fixed alliances. Meanwhile, countries across the global south are no longer just spectators. They're evaluating the summit's agenda and considering how it affects trade, defense cooperation, and diplomatic pressure. Thank you.